you, Kid and Jenny, for sharing from your trip. I'm in touch with Sean. He's planning to come and preach at our church around June, so you'll get to meet him personally. And perhaps when they do go back, when White Kid and Jenny, some of us may be able to go and share in the blessings. I think I learned two things if we go with White Kid. One, we will eat well. I think there's no doubt about that. But some of us may not come back alive the way they get hurt and injured on the trip. But it'll be great for us to begin our missions work overseas with COVID kind of calming down. Well, last Sunday was Easter Sunday. Before that, we spent 6-7 weeks looking at the letters that Jesus wrote to the 7 churches in Revelation. What would he say to churches in terms of what they were doing well and what they were doing not so well? And then today we're starting a new series in Ephesians. So today is the first Sunday. And we chose Ephesians because that's the letter where Paul talks most about what it means to be a church. What does an ideal church look like? And so starting today, we'll be looking at that letter. My suggestion is that if you have about 30 minutes this week to read through Ephesians in one setting. So 6 chapters, I think about half an hour that it'll take. Slowly read through and follow Paul's argument in the letter, and I think that will be helpful. Because today I'm looking at the context. So how did Paul find or plant the church in Ephesus? And then starting next week with Minister Chris, we'll start in verse 1 of chapter 1. And so you have a week to be able to read that. And so but if you look at the slide real quick, what we see here is that Paul planted the church in Ephesus in his second missionary journey. And so there's 2 dots there. When he went to Ephesus, he came from Corinth. So Corinth was his previous ministry. He spent about 1.5 years there planting a church. And then he goes to Ephesus and spends almost 3 years there. And these 2 churches are crucial for Paul's ministry because they're to be the foundation. They're the central fortress, let's say, from which he wants to reach out to the Gentile world. And so in his first year of ministry at Ephesus, Paul receives a message from one of Chloe's people. And the messenger brings this report that the church in Corinth is really struggling, that the wheels are coming off in a sense. They were in danger of going off the edge because they were struggling with a number of issues. So there's no perfect church. But Corinth was especially in difficult ire because they were gathering together and they're eating the Lord's Supper, and they're eating the Lord's Supper like it was a culinary orgy. You know, each group bringing their own food and they're eating by themselves. Some of them are getting drunk. Others are eating well, some are starving during the Lord's Supper. And then they're abusing the spiritual gifts. A number of spiritual gifts are given, and they're comparing their spiritual gifts with each other to see who had the better gift, and the speaking in tongues coming out on top. Believers were suing each other in secular court, gross sexual immorality. A man was living with his stepmother, something that the pagan world would be shocked by. And what's worse, Paul's thinking, where are the spiritual leadership? They're not saying anything. They're not doing anything about this. And then the most depressing issue of all, Corinth is experiencing division within the body. They couldn't agree what kind of pastor to bring in. And so they have these congregational meetings. The candidate comes in and they vote, and they cannot get a consensus, because everyone has a different idea of what a spiritual leader ought to look like. So there were some who wanted to be loyal to Paul because he was the founder of the church, and he's the one that brought them the gospel, one that taught them the faith in the very beginning. And then others wanted someone like Peter because, they wanted to keep the Jewish element intact within the Christian faith. And so while Paul preached the message to the Gentiles, and that's okay, Paul also seemed to want to eliminate quite a bit of Judaism out of Christianity. And there's a group that was sort of conservative. They wanted to keep the elements of Judaism while affirming Christianity. And then there were those who thought that a church that was located in Corinth, one of the major cities at the time, ought to have a pastor that was worthy of its name. When you bring unbelievers to church, you want to be proud of the pastor that you introduced them to, sort of a pastor of a mega church, charismatic, dynamic, handsome, all of that. And Apollos was a man that's described in Acts 18 as an eloquent man. He's mighty in the scriptures, and he speaks boldly in the synagogue. It's quite a CV. He's dynamic, knowledgeable, and courageous. And so there's this group that wanted him. And then finally, there's a fourth group, and this sort of a mysterious group. They're called followers of Christ. And it sounds really spiritual, but in fact, they're the most dangerous group of all because they would not submit to any human authority. Why do we need a pastor at all when you have the Spirit of God within you? Why do you need elders when we have Jesus? This is sort of like the Lone Ranger Christians who did not need the tradition of the church nor human authority. And this is how cults get started. And so you have this group there as well. And these four subgroups were so divided that when they got to the Lord's table, they would not sit in the same place. They did not eat together. They did not greet each other. And they were bickering and debating. And so Paul's writing the first letter to the Corinthians from Ephesus. He's writing it to the Corinthians. And he provides a number of solutions. He's trying to deal with the issues that they're facing. And the letter reads almost like a church consultant. So starting right in chapter 1, right? Here's your problem. Here's the solution. Here's your problem. This is sort of what you need to do. And on throughout. It's sort of like a solution manual for churches that are struggling. I don't know if you ever watched Kitchen Nightmares. Gordon Ramsay, Kitchen Nightmares, right? He goes, visits a restaurant that's kind of dying out, and then he studies it, and then he gives you a list of advice to follow. And usually there's always three, right? Now, use fresh ingredient, clean up your kitchen, and cut your menu down. When church restaurants struggle, they increase their offering. And I love his advice. Do few, but do it well. And it's sort of like that, somewhat exaggeration. But Paul is looking at Corinth and is struggling. He's offering a number of advice for them to get back on their feet. And he sends the letter off with Chloe's people as they go back to Corinth. And he thinks, wait a minute, a letter is not enough. They're really struggling. I need to go in person. And so he decides that he will leave Ephesus in the middle of his ministry plan and go back to Corinth because Corinth is imploding, but the ministry at Ephesus is exploding. He's never experienced anything like this. Everything he does in Ephesus, it's like turns into ministry gold. Every time he opens his mouth and preaches the gospel, people are getting saved left and right. It's unheard of. In fact, so many people were coming to Christ that it was affecting the city's economy, And so Ephesus is the center for the worship of Artemis. And what they do is they sell these little silver idols of Artemis. And so many people were coming to Christ that they were not buying these silver idols, that it was affecting the trade. Silver was losing its value in the stock market. Miners were losing their jobs. Craftsmen were losing their hours. Paul's gospel had such an impact upon the economy, sort of like COVID, right? Starting in March 2020, when COVID struck, a lot of the restaurants struggled and different places of business because everyone was quarantined. They weren't going to visit. It's sort of like that. The newfound believers were not going to the temples. They weren't going to the temple gift shops and buying these silver idols. And the owners are getting livid. And it's not just your average citizens that were getting saved. It was also people that you would have never imagined. So, you go out and you share the gospel, and you kind of like typecast. Well, this person high probability, this person low probability. And there were individuals there who practiced magic, who read palms, they casted spells. And they were coming to Christ, and they were so convicted of their previous lifestyle, they wanted to turn over a new leaf, that they were bringing their enchantment books and books on spells and all of this magical paraphernalia, and they're bringing it into the middle of the city, and they're having a bonfire. And Luke is so amazed at how much had come in that he says it was worth 50,000 pieces of silver. And then a ministry that was so phenomenal that there's no place else in the New Testament where that many miracles occurred except in the Gospels. Everywhere Paul goes, he's healing. And in fact, it got to a point where you did not even need Paul. So if Paul sneezed into a handkerchief and put it on a table, you can go in and sneak in and take the handkerchief and take it and put it on somebody who was sick, and they got healed. The blind saw, the lame walked, the demon-possessed were set free. What a ministry. I've never experienced anything like that. I wish, but I've never experienced it. It's like once in a lifetime. You know, the comparable illustration for me is if Paul went into Las Vegas and he started preaching the gospel and planted a church, and then so many people got saved that the casinos became like ghost towns. You know, the nightclubs are echoing in silence. And then the casino owners and the workers are getting saved, and they're so convicted they bring their slot machines and their blackjack tables, their bottles of liquor and cheaps, and they have this bonfire in the middle of the city. It's hard for me to fathom how much of the magnitude of the revival that Paul had experienced in Ephesus. You don't get success stories like that in every generation, not even once in a lifetime. In the summer of 1806, 5 Williams College students, 5 guys, decided that they would go out on a summer day and enjoy the beautiful day and study outside. And then a thunderstorm, flash storm came. They ran into a barn with haystacks lined up, and they started talking, and they said, hey, why don't we start praying together, wait out the storm? And so these 5 guys prayed together, and they enjoyed it so much that they went back the week after and the week after. And then within a month or two, they were joined by a number of other college students until it started spreading out throughout the city and throughout the state. And in fact, it spread so much that it became a movement, and then the prayer movement became a missions movement until 100,000 college students went out all over the world to preach the gospel. Oh, because 5 kids, out of the blue, to get out of the rain, started praying together. And every once in a while, you know, you do some type of ministry or you do something, and God just seems to place his hands upon it and just pours out his favor, and you can't do anything wrong. Everything you do, every prayer gets answered, and people are being converted left and right, and that's what Paul experienced. It was excuse the pun, but it was a magical time for him. And so Paul says, wow, everything's going so well in Ephesus that I think I can go in person to Corinth, because it takes more than a letter. It takes my presence. And so he goes. It turns out to be a terrible mistake. To say that the visit did not go well will be an understatement. In fact, he had gone to, and he planned to stay a certain number of months, but he had to cut it short because it was going so bad. And then when he was leaving, the congregation told him, don't come back unless we invite you. No more unannounced visits. And I think Paul was emotionally devastated. I think emotionally this has got to be one of his lowest points. Because, you know, when we think of Paul, we think of this guy, you know, he's like this superhero missionary and almost robotic. And yet when I read his letters, I see a guy who's deeply emotional for the churches that he has planted. So, you know, I went in seminary, you know, you either want to be like Jesus or you want to be like Paul. Oh, Jesus is God, Paul's more human, and so. But when we look at Paul, we think that he's sort of like that Duracell battery. You've seen the commercial, right? Just think of Apostle Paul, you know, just runs all day. Or remember the commercial way back on Timex, right? Takes a licking but keeps on ticking. That's what I think of Paul. Right? You punch him, he gets right up. Press a button, he preaches the gospel. But we forget that he's deeply emotional. That he is invested in the congregation. He prays for them night and day. And he says that all over the letters. He never holds back when he's with them. He's like, I'm a parent, a child to you. And then in Philippians, he says, look, my life is like one offering, and I pour it out upon the altar of your faith. I die every day so that you might live. And I do it with joy, with gladness. What a standard for a pastor to follow. And when the Corinthians rejected him, I think Paul was gutted out. It's very hard to imagine that kind of heartache, to have someone pour out so much into someone else to be rejected. And I think Paul left Corinth back for Ephesus with a broken heart. And part of him, I think, is sort of glad he's leaving Corinth. And part of him is looking forward to brighter days in Ephesus because it's going so well. And so he returns to Ephesus, and the ministry has taken a turn. Things are not going as well in the second half as it did in the first half. Because wherever Paul goes and wherever he plants churches, he always experiences opposition, whether from the Jews in the synagogues or from the Roman government. There's always opposition. But in the second half of his ministry in Ephesus, he experiences a level of opposition that he's never experienced before. And with a broken heart on top of that, he's crushed. He's vulnerable. He's at the end of his rope. Paul never tells you what it is. He doesn't tell you. There are a number of educated guesses. That some think that he was in prison. Others think that there was mass betrayal within the church. Others think that he was physically incapacitated. I don't know what it is, but he doesn't tell you. But we are certain that he experienced this fundamental obstacle that devastated his spirit. We see clues of this. So at the end of the letter of Romans, he writes and greets Priscilla and Aquila, who was with him in Corinth and in Ephesus. And if you look at the screen, he says, look, I'll greet them. They risked their lives for me. Whenever you're serving Christ, especially at that time and age, you're always facing risk. But Paul points it out especially. Look, they risked their lives for me. I think there's something happening in the second half of his ministry in Ephesus. Priscilla and Aquila stood up on his behalf, facing the danger of that possibility. We find another clue. Later on, Paul is on his way back to Jerusalem, and he passes by Ephesus, but he does not stop and visit. Now, if you look at Paul's ministry, he constantly revisits the churches he has planted, but he does not visit Ephesus, a church that he has served for 3 years, and he sails by. And Luke says, well, it's because Paul was in a hurry to get to Jerusalem by Pentecost, but if you read between the lines, I think Paul didn't want to go back to the place where his memories still haunt him, still too raw. Perhaps the best indicator that something happened is the change between his writing in Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. So, Corinthians is written towards the beginning, middle of his ministry in Ephesus. 2 Corinthians is written after something had occurred, toward the end of his ministry in Ephesus. And when he writes it back to them, sends it to them, when you read the two letters, they're very different. They're very different. The first letter is like a solution manual for a church's struggle. The second one is sort of like a diary of a guy who's half depressed, who's fighting his way out from the darkness into the light. It's the same Paul that wrote the two letters, but the 2 Corinthians is written in a minor chord. It's deep and sad, because Paul had entered the winter of his pastoral ministry, the dark night of the soul. In fact, translators say that when you translate 1 Corinthians, pretty straightforward, flows well. When you translate 2 Corinthians, it's extremely difficult. It's one of the more difficult letters to translate in the New Testament because the sentence structure is so twisted. It's torture, as though his troubled soul was bleeding onto the letters of the page. And the theme of suffering is found everywhere in 2 Corinthians. When you have a chance, just read it through in one sitting. He starts off in the very beginning in chapter 1, like when you're struggling, God comforts you so that you can take that comfort and comfort others who are struggling. Because when I was in deep pain, God was with me. And then he writes of his ministry in Ephesus. If you look up, the load we had to carry was far too heavy for us. It got to the point where we gave up on life itself. I felt suicidal in this ministry. Yes, deep inside ourselves, we received the death sentence. I can only imagine what Paul had gone through in order to make that kind of gut-wrenching declaration. And then it continues from this letter. We see what more profound spiritual truths, that if you want to go deeper in the faith, what God will do is He will push you, and He will push you until you're at the brink of your breaking point. Never beyond so that you break, but to the very edge to show you how much you need Him. And so he says things like, we are under all kinds of pressure, but we are not crushed completely. So he didn't push us beyond the boundary. We are at a loss, but not at our wit's end. We are persecuted, but not abandoned. We are cast down, but not destroyed. For you to be able to say that in the pastoral ministry, for you to be able to say that in your personal spiritual life, you must have suffered to the very edge. The opposition and the burden of ministry took Paul to the very edge. For a servant of Paul's caliber, it's hard to imagine what it could have been, but he does not name it. But what it did was it brought him to a crisis point where he had to sit down and say, do I really trust God or not? Do I really trust God or not? Or am I doing this ministry in my own ability? You know, all the experiences that I had, all the training, the knowledge, the discipline. But see, when you get to that very edge of that breaking point, you begin to wonder, am I really trusting God or not? And Paul says, wow, I wasn't really trusting Him. Because when things are going half well, it's easy to trust God. When you're in that dark night of the soul, you begin to wonder and question. So he says things like, this happened to me. To stop relying on ourselves. What, he didn't rely on God before this ministry? Of course he did. But he got to a point where he realized that it was not complete submission, and to make us rely on the God who raises the dead. And I think this is what Paul learned in his ministry in Ephesus, that spiritual journey is not about getting stronger or becoming more knowledgeable or more proficient. It's actually realizing how little you really matter in the kingdom of God. How weak you really are. You remember my sermon before Easter, that Sunday? Even a faith the size of a mustard seed, if you plant it in a soul that is desperate and hungry for God, no ministry mountain can stand in your way. And I think that's what Paul learned. You know, I'm told that when you're working out, and I really don't work out the muscle building type, but I read that people who work out, that their gaining of strength is not linear. So it's not like straight line up this way. But it's sort of like the stock market. It kind of goes up and down, up and down. But people who work out, they also talk of plateaus and then leaps. So that you're kind of like working out every day and you're faithful, but you're not really growing stronger. And then suddenly there's this leap up and you hit the next level and then you kind of plateau out. That's sort of how it works for them. I think that's true of the spiritual life. We're all praying, reading the Bible, serving at church, but nothing's really changing that much. And then one day God just pours out His favor and then you have this quantum leap and then you're plateau out and you know, when these things happen, we look back and we think, wow, what did I do for that quantum leap to occur? You know, we're trying to replicate, and you really can't, because one day God just says, you know, I'm going to move you to the next level. Did you know since 1860, or since the haystack prayer time, we have been trying to replicate the haystack prayer movement ever since? Can't replicate. God just places His hands upon you one day, and He blesses you beyond your wildest imagination. The Spirit blows where it wants. Cannot direct it. But there is one non-negotiable. Any athlete that gets better must endure pain. Any Christian who grows deeper in the spiritual life must suffer. That is a non-negotiable. And so the closest thing we have of Paul describing the effect of this kind of suffering is in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. It's a thorn in the flesh, right? He has a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, and they harass and frustrate, and it drives him nuts. And he prays 3 times, Lord, take it away, take it away, take it away. But God does not, because in order for him to hit the next level of his spiritual life in his ministry, he must endure this level of suffering so that he might realize how little power he really has. That in a spiritual battle, all of your experiences, your training means very little unless you are relying upon God. And so he prays every morning, God, take it away, take it away. And every morning he finds himself with a thorn in the flesh until his prayer changes from, Lord, take it away, to, your grace is sufficient for me, for his power is perfected in my weakness. See, that's when you know you really want to grow. You stop praying, God, take it away, take this issue away, take this problem away. To God, thank you for the grace that enables me to experience my weakness during those times. I think it was his suffering in Ephesus which made Paul write one of the most personal letters, 2 Corinthians. And he says in the letter, we have this treasure of the gospel message, a treasure. That as Elder Core prayed, a restless world, this is the gospel that will change. But God put it in jars of clay, so that the world will never be tempted to confuse the message from the vessel. And so God put Paul through the ringers so that he may know in his heart that it's not him. It's all the gospel message. That the world might see that the greatness of the power of the gospel belongs to God and not to us. When you read Ephesians, and I pray that you would, look for the number of times he talks about power, power, power. It's all throughout. And when you read that, just think, oh, he learned weakness. That's why he can talk about power. And so I trust that next week as we start with chapter 1, verse 1, that God would bless your heart and that God would bless us through this series so that we might grow in likeness to the kind of church where Jesus would be able to say, well done, good and faithful servant. And all God's people said,